Okay, hello. Here we are with Professor Peter Norton of the University of Virginia, also the author of the books Fighting Traffic and Autonorama. I first learned about your work, Professor Norton. Well, I've had your books on my reading list for a while, but then I saw your LinkedIn post in which you had a quote from your book, Autonorama, page 205. If you don't mind, I'm just going to read a segment of it because this really caught my eye, and it's what led me to writing to you and saying I really need to talk with you. You published a quote from the book Autonorama, page 205. The histories of the car that we grew up with were told for us by Motordom. Pronounce that correctly?
Yes.
Their versions of history captured the real enthusiasm for cars, calling it America's love affair with the automobile. But they selectively omitted persistent resistance, especially in cities, to car domination. The resistance was ubiquitous, stubborn, and enduring. And it goes on, and I will publish that quote when I publish this video, but I was really captured by this quote, and know that when I haven't read your books yet, they're on my list. I will be getting them, and I know I will be have a pencil in hand and be making so many notes, because this issue of America's love affair with the automobile and car domination and car dependence is really central at Pedestrian Space. I say that our focus at the platform is about walkability and its central uh, place in sustainable urban development, but we cannot centralize it without focusing on the problem that is car dependence, which is what your books appear to really get deep into the grit and documenting how this came to be. So thank you. Looking forward to talking with you during this segment. And yes, would you like to share a bit, first of all, about simply your motivation getting into this work and this writing and histories?
Yes. Oh, it's a pleasure to be talking with you, Annika. I'm a big admirer of the work that you do, and I agree with you that the question before us as we think about how to become less car dependent, become much less car dependent, is, well, how did we become so car dependent in the first place? And the first country to become car dependent was the US. And in other countries that have followed that path toward car dependency, it's been a very similar path. And one of the traits that this path toward car dependency has in common between the US and other countries is that stories are told that justify this path, or that make it appear to be the path that was the popular will, the democratic choice, or sometimes the free market choice. It was none of those things. It certainly was not those things in the US. But to understand that, we have to begin by making a really important distinction. Cars are, for most people, attractive things. They give us an opportunity to go faster and further than before and offer many other practical benefits. But that's a very different thing, the sort of inherent attraction of cars and what they can do, from car dependency, which is a situation where the car isn't an advantage over your alternatives. It becomes the only choice and therefore not a choice at all. And so I'm often find myself up against a view that says, well, how can you argue that this was not the democratic choice? Because after all, people do tend to like cars. And my reply to that is, people like cars, but they like choices even more. And so if you have cars without choices, you are not offering people what they really want. And in fact, you can't even tell anymore what they really want, because in a car dependent world, driving is not a choice, and therefore we can't interpret ubiquitous driving as an expression of choice.
Yes, that is really so interesting. And as you put it, car dependency does not offer the advantage of the freedom that car use is associated with this image, especially this, perhaps as Americans, we also have this uniquely um, uh, image of freedom associated with the car, but other cultures as well. It's almost, I would say, it's almost in our American DNA and culture. This relationship with the car as liberty and a lifestyle of freedom and choice, whereas the reality is so different. And you've been working with these
It
themes
really
for.
is. I mean,
Go ahead.
oh, it really is. I mean, there's a paradox. If the car is what you must have to have something like freedom, then I think this raises a question, is that really freedom that you have? Wouldn't freedom really include the freedom to not own a car without being disabled, in effect, as a result?
And so your work sort of details how we got to this place and breaking down the myth that this was what everybody wanted, correct?
Yes. Hmm.
Because there seems to be, as I understand from your books, you really are getting into the history of the resistance in cities to encroaching car
That's right.
pollution.
So the histories of the automobile that we grow up with in this country, in the US, are overwhelmingly histories that tell us that the US is a car culture, that this is what people always wanted and preferred, and as soon as they had the chance, they got one, and thanks to Henry Ford, they were affordable for most people. And none of that is completely false, but we know that when people are selective, that when they tell half-truths that are accurate half-truths, they can still be profoundly misleading. What you leave out of a story can make that story misleading, even if the story's particular stated facts are accurate. So the number one storyteller, the number one historian of the automobile in the USA was the automobile industry and its allies, other interest groups. They used to call themselves, that constellation of interest groups used to call itself motordom. And I find that such a useful word. It's so much more efficient than saying automobile manufacturers, dealers, retailers, uh, parts suppliers. The list goes on. It's much easier just to say motordom, that old-fashioned word. So that's why I've revived it. And motordom started telling the history of the automobile back in the early 1930s, and they have never stopped. And those histories are still the same. They say this was the democratic choice, which is very interesting because when you look at the internal documents, not secret documents, but the internal documents within the auto industry, and see what they were telling themselves within motordom, they were constantly anxious that people had didn't think that they had to have a car. I can't tell you how many articles and statements I found at meetings, transcripts of speeches, and so on, where people within motordom are saying, we're in big trouble because people find owning a car a nuisance and a lot of them won't buy one. And so with among themselves, their explanation was exactly the opposite. It wasn't that it was the democratic choice. It was that they were going to have to sort of re-engineer America to make it the necessary choice.
Wow, that's pretty intense. Re-engineering America to make it the necessary choice, which is exactly what happened, basically.
Yes, it is. It
And you,
is. It yes, I can explain that. So, um, to operate an automobile on a city street in 1920 was to enter a world that was hostile to driving, particularly in a city, because for one thing, pedestrians were free to walk anywhere they wanted. Yes, they usually crossed at the intersection at a crossing, but often they went right into the middle of the street where the street railway tracks were. So almost every city in America, even small cities, had electric street railways, and you boarded the street railway in the middle of the street where the track was, and you left the railway, you left the streetcar in the middle of the street and walked back to the curb. And all of that was perfectly normal, everyday behavior for everyone, not just for the more reckless or whatever. And so this made driving difficult because either you had to wait for these people or you incurred their animosity by honking your horn and driving aggressively, and then the city authorities would blame you and not the pedestrian. So that's just one of many examples of how the environment of 100 years ago was hostile to driving, and to make it friendly to driving took really changing things in three categories. One was the laws to give the driver priority in the street. That was a very hard struggle. It was ultimately a very successful struggle too. The other was social norms like who belongs in the street. If you walk in the street, are you doing something good or bad? And the third thing they had to change was engineering standards. In other words, if a if you want to make driving safe, do you make the cars go slowly, or do you rebuild roads so that fast driving is safe for the drivers? And that means doing things like separating the lanes and putting overpasses at the intersections and putting shoulders along the side of the road. And if you choose that latter course of action of building highways, well, that's an expression of the view that says that the way you make traffic safe is to make fast driving safe and not to slow down cars. So they changed laws, social norms, and engineering standards to prioritize driving over everything else. And in the US, they were very successful at this. And then the US exported this model first to Western Europe and then to much of the rest of the world. After World War II, in particular, American influence in Western Europe was extremely great. Often it was presented as, you know, development assistance for a war-torn continent. But with that development of assistance, of course, came agenda advancement, and that included making Europe into a car-dependent sphere as well.
I would love to read a quote from your book, Fighting Traffic, that you shared with me. The quote reads, "The US became a society of car-dependent cities largely because enterprises with a business interest in automobiles to protect and expand their markets organized in the 1920s and 1930s to overcome powerful local resistance to car domination, shifting laws, engineering standards, and social norms to prioritize motor vehicles in streets," which is basically everything you just said in a nutshell as well. So that was fighting traffic. And do I understand correctly, Autonorama, I'm not sure if I pronounced it correctly, is your second book?
That's right. And
Okay,
to get the second book title right, you just say autonomous
right.
plus Futurama, and so that becomes Autonorama.
Autonorama. I have to practice that. Autonorama.
Yes,
So,
perfect,
yes,
perfect.
Autonorama. Okay, so can you share a bit about the difference with Autonorama um, from fighting traffic?
Yes, of course. So, um, fighting traffic's essential argument is that car domination was not the democratic choice, but it is, but to succeed in that effort, you have to persuade people that it is the democratic choice, or you have to make it an attractive choice, or as attractive as you can. This is really a sales job. So America was not only a pioneer of car dependency, it was also a pioneer of consumerism and of the sales techniques that make consumerism work. So consumerism, of course, is the problem or solution to the problem of having a economy that can produce more goods than people really need. And so the task then becomes to convince people that they need things they don't know they need or don't think they need, and probably actually don't need at all. Now, to do that takes a kind of technique that includes promises of happiness that will come in the future if you only buy today. If you buy the product today, and whether the product is shampoo or an automobile, the message is this will bring you happiness in the future. Now, in the case of selling car dependency, fighting traffic is about the early years of that, and Autonorama is about how we have inherited this technique and are still practicing it today, to convince people that car dependency is the path to happiness. Now, that's got to be difficult when you realize that, of course, the same product, car dependency now, driving, has been sold as the key to happiness for, in the US, it's been sold for 100 years, and it hasn't delivered. Uh, Being stuck on a highway is not happiness. And so the problem for automobile companies was to find ways to keep people believing this message that car dependency will deliver happiness to you. And their problem is compounded by the fact that it never has for 100 years. And the answer to this problem is to associate your car dependency with the latest, most amazing technology. So, most people are old enough to remember the first time they used a smartphone compared to a old style flip phone. Many people are old enough to remember having grown up without being able to do an online search and then being able to do an online search or to watch a video online. And these things are really amazing. They're so amazing that they can make the impossible seem possible. And that fact is exactly modern motordom, what modern motordom has exploited to convince us that even though car dependency has never worked and never made us happy, it will do so this time, because now we have a new generation of automobiles that are not even really automobiles at all. They're autonomous vehicles. They're like smartphones on wheels. They're so amazing that they will finally make car dependency work. And so they're exploiting a paradox, and the paradox is, one, the technology truly is amazing. There's no question about it. But two, that does not mean the technology can do everything. There's certain things technology can't do, and one of them is make car dependency work, because car dependency is inherently the wrong approach to moving people and freight.
Right. And in a sort of abstract you sent me, you noted that the promotion of autonomous vehicles is the fourth generation of such efforts, referring to the failed promises. So the fourth generation, what we're in now, the promotion of these autonomous vehicles. So what are your thoughts? What are your thoughts now? I mean, you're an expert on the history of the failure of car dependence, and the details of how we got here. What are your thoughts about the current state we're in and moving forward?
I think we're in a very dangerous situation. We're in the dangerous situation that we are at risk of falling for a sales technique that says that car dependency can work if we only invest or spend enough money on the technology that allegedly will make it work. To me, that risk is exactly or very closely like the risk we faced a generation or two ago when tobacco companies tried to convince people that they did not have to quit smoking. All they needed was this amazing cigarette filter on their brand of cigarettes with this amazing tobacco formulation that was safe. We know as a scientific fact that those were untrue. I mean, to put it bluntly, those were lies, but those lies were persuasive. They were presented persuasively, and many millions of people lost decades of their lives because of that distraction. Well, if it's possible to imagine the stakes are even higher now, we are being told the same thing. Amazing technology was supposed to make cigarette smoking safe. Now, amazing technology is supposed to make car dependency work. We have to question this. We have to refute this. The tobacco example is instructive because in the end, after too long, but eventually people figured out, many people at least figured out, that that was a lie. And we need to recognize that this attempt to sell car dependency on the basis of technology making it work is equally dangerous or more so. And we have to recognize that fact too. And we're not there yet.
I think it's so fascinating that you bring up the tobacco example. I think anybody who's been around for some decades and seen this shift, it's quite an incredible shift that happened with tobacco. I'm an ex-smoker myself. Many years ago, I quit, but I remember when you could
Me
smoke
too.
on. You are as well. Okay, so knowing it from that personal, if you're not a smoker, you didn't probably pay attention, although you might have been annoyed by all the smoke around you because not so long ago, you could smoke in airplanes. The absurdity now thinking about it, having row, whatever, 30 to 50 as smoking rows in this confined
Right.
craft. I think
And
earlier you
on
could probably smoke
buses, people
on,
smoked. Yeah.
on buses,
Hmm.
probably in hospitals, everywhere. There
Yes,
was so
everywhere.
progressively it became outlawed. I'm sure there's some great books on that, outlawed from the workplace or this or there. But I mean, it was really not so long ago that you could freely smoke. There were smoking sections in restaurants, which in many countries is gone now. It's completely gone.
Right, right.
And
And
even
when the proposals were new, they were controversial, but the people were outraged. But now people can't even imagine it being different. And that's heartening because it means that unimaginable change is possible.
right,
And that's a fact we really need to work with.
unimaginable and really radical change. And if you think about it now, it can
That's
even
right.
seem almost trivial considering the fact that it's almost impossible to smoke in many public spaces now. Even I think in some
That's
cities you
right.
can't even, not publicly on the sidewalk. But at the time, yeah, if you mentioned it, it seemed radical and unimaginable.
It really did.
Unimaginable. Yeah,
It really did.
yeah. So that
And
is really a
incidentally,
great example.
driving everywhere, driving everywhere once seemed radical too.
Right.
There's an amazing editorial written in 1922 by a man in Motordom who said we need a radical revision in our conception of what a city street is for. And by that he meant that driving everywhere was a radical idea and it eventually became normal. And we have to sort of recognize that it was a radical idea to start with and that the normal thing is that streets are for people.
So, as somebody who's interested in advocating for walkability for as long as I can, as long as I'm present on this planet, how, what would you recommend or any insights you have also on communicating with motordom? I don't know if we can call it that today, but but there are people and human beings, in this motordom, and it's hard for me to believe that many of them don't themselves appreciate walkability, if not even for themselves, then maybe for children, so that they don't have to chauffeur teenagers around. Many people who
Right.
who are not really so. Many people who use a car and don't mind it can, I think, reflect on car dependency with other people that they might be driving around. For example, me, I don't drive, but my husband does, and I am a very reluctant passenger when we go places. I don't like being in the car really that much. So I think many people who are not like me or like other people who are really just nuts about walkability, they can reflect on this from the standpoint of family members, for example, or children, older
Right.
children who want
Right.
freedom to move and don't want to have to be shuttled around, which is the case for many suburban families, for example. So, do
Yes.
you have any thoughts about communicating with the auto industry or with people in these complexes of thought? Uh,
Yes. I have to start by saying I don't hold much hope that the auto industry is reachable. Um, they have a long history of fighting against making walkability a normal mode of transport. And in fact, some of their more troubling efforts have been those that try to contend that car dependency can work with walkability. They're quite antagonistic things, and the risk of trying to persuade them that walking and walkability are important is that they'll try to persuade us that they can make a car dependent world where you can walk. And this and this is not new. They tried to argue way back in the 1930s that if you rebuild cities for cars, they can be very attractive places for walkers too. You just put the walkers on elevated sidewalks that go everywhere. Well, first of all, they didn't ever want the money going into elevated sidewalks, which is why there weren't any or almost none. And second, actually walking in such a place is very unpleasant. They
mhm.
tried to persuade us that um, urban highways would be nice places to walk because they would be lined with trees and grass. But even in those rare cases where they are lined with trees and grass, nobody wants to walk there because it's very unpleasant walking anywhere near fast vehicles. So that's all my way of saying I don't think we're going to spend our time and energy usefully trying to persuade the auto industry to change its position. But companies do respond to pressure. The pressure can be direct pressure, and it can be also, of course, political pressure or legal pressure in the case of lawsuits and so on. So, one of the reasons why tobacco and smoking in particular is no longer pervasive, well, in the US, I believe it was in 1969, television ads for cigarettes were banned, which was an amazing thing, an amazing achievement. And uh, it was a signal not only that we're not going to, as a society, we're not going to promote smoking, but also it was a signal that companies did have a limit uh, and were ultimately accountable for matters of public health. And um, the auto industry has been under similar pressure at times, but the response has been rather than to restrict driving, to try to re-engineer the vehicle to make driving safe for the vehicle occupant or to reduce the emissions from the vehicle, which in effect became ways of preserving car dependency rather than fixing car dependency. But if the tobacco companies eventually could be made financially liable for the health damage they caused and also could be restricted so that advertising couldn't be ubiquitous and so that smoking as a practice could not be ubiquitous. Well, that's a model, and it's a model of how we can respond to car dependency. And it's a model that's been applied successfully already, particularly at the city level. Um, all over the world, including in the US, there are pedestrian advocacies. Very often they're allied with bicycle or transit advocacies. And in some cities, they've scored remarkable successes. And I think we have a lot to learn from those advocates. In the US, I would mention Sally Phlox in Atlanta, who founded an organization about 30 years ago that really drew attention to this need. But there are, of course, similar advocacies in most other cities, and some of them have achieved successes that make them examples, the examples we need to resist car dependency.
Also, I was curious if you see a shift in storytelling. You mentioned earlier that historically the number one storyteller of autos and auto culture was the automobile industry, which is obviously very imbalanced. So, but do you see a shift right now in storytelling?
Well, first of all, there are a lot of good storytellers out there. I hesitate to name examples because I don't want to exclude anyone, but to offer I mean, there are some wonderful YouTubers, bloggers, and journalists who are telling stories that are reaching audiences of millions. Um, there's a, a Clarence Eckerson is a filmmaker who makes YouTube videos and videos for streets films, and some of the most popular ones just show very attractively what freedom from car dependency, which is real freedom, of course, can look like. I think his most popular video, which has millions of views, is about how Utrecht in the Netherlands went from a city that was already comparatively bike friendly to a real cyclist's uh, paradise almost. And that's very powerful storytelling. You are, you know, helping storytellers of all kinds, yourself and others, to reach larger audiences as well. And as you know, there are many others who are doing complementary work. And my suggestion for storytellers is include some history, because one of the reasons why we have car dependency is that motordom tried to persuade us that history was on the side of car dependency, which was very hard to do, because in fact, uh, if we dig a little deeper, we find that there has always been advocacy for pedestrians. There has always been advocacy for cyclists in transit. There's always been resistance to car dependency. And history really is on the side of the people who say that streets are for people, as they always were until the 20th century.
Well, and I think, and I will be sharing that and quoting you to, as a storytelling idea to include the history. And many people I know who are storytellers, they love reading too. So, people are always talking about the books. They're in there's, as you know, a wealth of books about urbanism and mobility, but I think yours will be really great and essential references for this history component. So I look forward to quoting you, to reading your both
Thank
of your
you.
books and your articles. There's
Thank you.
one article you shared with me recently, Persistent Pedestrianism. If you don't mind, I'm going to read one quote from that as well, that I probably will
Sure.
also post later on my channels later this week. So from your article, Persistent Pedestrianism. In the US, advocates of walkability are often cast as working against a historically predominant car culture. Yet overlooked evidence indicates that cities, in popular efforts to resist car domination, were common throughout the decades that are now considered the apogee of car culture in America. For me, I'm learning as well through your work that even the, even I think I have the myth in my mind that this was sort of what the culture wanted, but your work is also helping me to see the resistance that was there. That's really so useful and heartening. I'm curious too. Obviously, there's a shift going on in many places with mobility, some places more than others. You see the political will in many municipalities, the need to reduce emissions, and then in other places we see car dependency really picking up steam, basically. What are your thoughts? Maybe we close out with this question. What are your thoughts and concerns even about the current mobility paradigm shift, if we can say that there is a shift underway?
Well, I think you framed it very nicely, because we do see contradictory trends. I mean, the trend that is exemplified by Paris, for example, is breathtaking and inspiring and encouraging and heartening. But at the same time, we find that particularly in so-called developing countries, India, China, Brazil, etc., we find history's mistakes being repeated. We find the misplaced esteem in car ownership uh, repeated. And we find industry groups promoting and exploiting these uh, opportunities as they would see them to increase car dependency in those countries. Um, Now, I mean, in a way, I think this is an echo of colonialism, where the colonial powers taught the colonized powers with compulsion that the values of consumption, consumerism, market economies that are anything but free market economies, but are indeed market economies, um, are are the modern way, are the way to enlightenment. And if if we're seeing versions of that message, that sales pitch is what it really is, going on today, I think there's an opportunity for local people in those countries to say, look, this is a version of colonialism. This is the same lie that we were sold when we were a politically colonized country. We're now being sort of economically colonized by the people who want to put us in a position of dependency again. And so I think it's possible to enlist that anti-colonial fervor that put an end to old school colonialism in the form of sort of supposed possessions of the colonized power. We could put that to work against the 21st century version of colonialism, which is this effort to turn developing countries into endless consumers of goods, including automobiles and driving, that don't actually serve the interests of the people who are there.
Well, yeah, this is very intense, and part of the challenge is that there's seems to be at the local levels sometimes such a, as we saw in our own country, such a willingness or such a local fervor too to want this, to want the home in the suburbs and the expansion, and of course then you're going right into what many of us grew up with in North America, is understanding that the car dependence that comes with suburban life and this and that. And it seems like there's some level of almost brainwashing, because in places where it's just now picking up steam, people are adopting it and craving it in a way. But it's also because it's being pitched to them as development.
That's right. And it's not only that it's being pitched to them as development, it's also that, I mean, even in the US, we would have nothing like the car dependency that we have today, even with the popular attraction of cars, if it hadn't been for the re-engineering that made car dependency uh, possible. So, for example, if a country like India, for example, did not put flyways and urban highways through its cities, a lot of people who have bought cars there would not have bought a car. And let's face it, those urban highways in India are not serving more than a small minority of the population. So they're anti-democratic in that sense. And many of the people who bought a car so that they could use them would not have bought a car otherwise, simply because without them, you can't get a, if you have a car, you can't get around crowded streets very well. So um, it's not only that people are falling for a sales pitch, it's also that their governments, their policymakers, are accommodating a minority of people at the cost of the majority, until that majority sort of relents, a fraction of the majority relents and perhaps buys a car that they can't afford because their environments have been reconstructed around them needing that car.
Right. I really appreciate how you put that, as that is also what as I'm learning about different regions, really understanding in many of these places, it's so imbalanced. The level of car ownership is so low, but how that ownership is being catered to so far outweighs how safe pedestrian mobility infrastructure and public transit is being accommodated. The balance just is completely out of line.
It's crucial. It's a crucial fact that massive efforts to accommodate driving always preceded car dependency. And so this is is a fact that works against the mistaken notion that car dependency came first and then they built the infrastructure for it later.
Mm,
Um, yeah, it's a demonstrable fact that certainly in the US that's not the case, and I don't think it's the case elsewhere either. The infrastructure came first. It served a small minority of people. Most people did not own or drive cars, and so the car dependency is never merely a reflection of mass democratic preferences.
mhm. Never. Never. That's a very good point. I think we'll close out there. I want to say I'm
Okay,
so looking forward to reading your books and to future dialogue
thank
with
you.
you. So thank you for
Thank
your
you so
time.
much, Annika. Thank you for yours and for your interest and for your work. I really applaud the work that you do, because it's exactly what we need to do. I work in a university. I'm lucky if I reach 100 students or 200 students a year, and my academic work is perhaps not as attractive to the everyday person who just wants a quick reader-friendly look. And so, we depend on the whole world depends on advocates like you who can get the message out as you do.
Well, I hope to have a growing global audience at Pedestrian Space, and I would say many, if not most people in that audience are happy to talk about car dependency most days of the week and the problems that it has created in our life. So it's going to be great to share this this video with everybody, and also to begin referencing your work because it's so important.
Excellent. Okay. All right. Well, it's been a pleasure, Annika.